All right, welcome back to the language and landscape of food safety. Again, I'm Dr. Michelle Fannin-Steele, and let's jump right on into it and play my favorite game of Who Inspected It. And so what we have in front of ourselves here is ground beef. And I thought we would go through on this and several other examples what makes food safety and regulations so incredibly complicated. So the ground beef that you have in front of you can be inspected actually by a variety of different regulatory authorities. So if this is commodity ground beef, it's inspected by the USDA and shipped across state lines. If this is ground beef that is produced and if it's slaughtered and fabricated, as we call it, and sold within state lines, then this could be inspected by a state Department of Agriculture. If this is ground beef that is made where the beef itself is ground, so like a butcher shop, the beef is ground at a butcher shop, and the butcher shop is getting in carcasses or primals. This beef is, get this, regulated by the USDA under something called the beef grind rule. If this is made in a restaurant that gets in beef primals or beef carcasses, it's regulated by the food code. Not confusing at all, right? So this is a really good example of the things that can make the regulatory infrastructure so complicated, and why when I work with people and talk to them about entrepreneurship in the food space, the questions are, what do you make and how do you make it? Okay, because if you want to grind beef, you have to know who's going to regulate you, because you have to write your food safety planning in a way that they understand and that you can execute. Okay, and that's merely one example. So let's go through another example that's also pretty complicated. We have a chicken in front of us. Okay, so if this is a commodity chicken, it's most likely grown in the southeast of the United States by a contract grower and then slaughtered and processed in a USDA plant. Okay, if this chicken is being killed in a plant that kills fewer than 20,000 chickens a year, then this chicken is inspected by a state Department of Agriculture. If this chicken is killed in a process where they kill fewer than, depending on the state, 1,000 to 2,000 birds per year, this can be killed with almost no inspection whatsoever. Okay, so poultry is all slaughtered in America, which under USDA inspection, state inspection by the Department of Ag, or custom exempt inspection for non-wholesale purposes. So somebody who grows more than under 1,000 birds and slaughters them can't wholesale them, so they can't sell them to a restaurant. But that's slaughter only. What if you want to take that chicken and part it? You know, when we cut chickens up, it's called parting. If it's a commodity chicken, that's going to involve a commodity process, and it's going to be USDA inspected. If it happens and it's only going to be sold within the state, that can be done under the state Department of Agriculture. If it happens at a butcher shop, it's done under the state food code. And if it happens at a restaurant, it's also done under the state food code or the locality food code in either the butcher or the restaurant. Okay, so it's really complicated. And there are some species of poultry which none of that applies to. So if you want to do quail, quail is actually FDA regulated. And so when you're talking to people about getting into local food and raising local food, they really have to know whether or not they can, they're raising something that we call an amenable species. All right. And an amenable species is one that falls under the Meat and Poultry Products Inspection Act. If it falls outside of that, it's under FDA inspection, even if it's meat or poultry. So quail is part of that, buffalo is part of that, Any deer species that is not a red deer, those are all non-amenable species that are slaughtered and killed for the food stream, and that's all under FDA. All right, so our next example is another FDA example, and this is fruit, okay, and fruit juices. So the fruit in this picture would be grown under something called the produce rule under FSMA. The juice that comes from that fruit would be produced under the FDA and juice HACCP. If that juice is pasteurized and then canned or otherwise hermetically sealed, like you see here, so that's so even though these are not in a can, these are anaerobically packaged and hermetically sealed, and they fall under something called the low acid canned food regulation, also under the FDA. So a processor could be producing juice and a low acid canned food and have to comply with both of those regulations for the same product. Next, tomatoes. Okay, so tomatoes, like the one you see on the right here, that would be grown under the produce rule. Okay, then if that's packaged and sent off to the market to another processor or whatever, it has to be transported under the sanitary transport rule because of the way we package tomatoes. The tomato on the left there, that tomato has been cut. All right. Once the tomato has been cut, it's then subjected to the preventive controls rule. All right. And so if you take this tomato and you cut it, you add mozzarella and basil and maybe a little olive oil and some vinegar, well, that's a caprese salad. All of that is, that assemblage is covered under the preventive controls rule. The mozzarella is covered under the pasteurized milk ordinance. The basil, depending on where it comes from, is inspected under the produce rule, USDA Good Agricultural Practices, perhaps, or the Leafy Greens Marketing Association out in California. They have industry regulations that they have put forth on the growing of ready-to-eat greens. It's even a tomato, even just growing a tomato is tremendously complicated. Alcohol. So alcohol itself, the actual manufacturing of alcohol itself, is regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. But the ingredients that go into the alcohol, if it's hops, well, hops is generally a commodity product. If it's a non-commodity product, then you have to find out whether or not it needs to be grown under the produce rule. It's a not ready-to-eat food, but it's not clear whether or not it goes through a kill step, as it were, in the brew process. Is it a hot brew process? Is it a cold brew process? Most things are a hot brew process, so we don't really worry about the food safety on the hops, but you need to know the manufacturing process. What about flavoring hops that are added at the end of the wort? Well, what temperature is everything added at? Is it added at when it's really, really hot, or is it added after it's cooled down? If it's added after it's cooled down, well, then there's no kill step, and so there's food safety planning that has to go along into that. That's alcohol, and it's just, you know, everything can be this complicated, and every entrepreneur needs to know when they're going into the food business that things are this complicated. And then I thought I would throw in, because I'm you know, doing this from Maine, and we have recreational and medicinal cannabis legal here in Maine, that cannabis in the 6 states where it's recreationally legal, including this one, is regulated under the food code. So if you remember, the food code was what was regulating the serving of food in restaurants. Well, the manufacture and extraction of cannabis has absolutely nothing to do and looks nothing like the production and sale of hot plates of food in a restaurant. Yet this is the only mechanism, the food code is the only mechanism that states have to regulate the production and manufacture of marijuana. And so even going into that, you need to, because it's a consumable item being sold to a being sold to a population that could be vulnerable, especially in the case of medical marijuana, the food safety planning needs to take into account the vulnerability of that population. And there's no regulatory authority around that does that. So that brings us to what does this all mean? Well, at the end of the day, what it means is that the companies that are producing the food, that are growing the food, are the ones that are responsible for making sure that the food is safe. And if you think about it, they're also the only ones that can control it. You know, the FDA, the USDA, your local food inspector, they cannot control on a day-to-day basis whether or not you're doing things correctly. Only you can if you're making the food. And so what we talk about is creating a culture of food safety where we take our inputs and our raw materials, we take our actions and the programs that we've written, and we transform them with our process to create our packaged product results. All right? That's how you do things. You take raw materials, you store them, you process them, you package and label them, you store them again, and then you distribute them. All right? That's food processing. And you got to create a culture from the very beginning of compliance so that you can be in not only regulatory compliance, so you don't land in jail, but you can build the company that you want to build. Okay? Now, I'm going to dive into, after we've done all that, I'm going to dive into something called hazards-based food safety planning, because the FDA and the USDA and local health inspection, local health departments and departments of agriculture all require what we call hazards-based food safety planning. In America, we do hazards-based food safety planning. In other parts of the world, they do risk-based food safety planning, okay? Hazards-based food safety planning is planning based on controlling physical, chemical, and microbial problems that can go along with the food. And I'm going to go way into depth into some of those, okay, so that you can gain an understanding of the complexity of things that need to happen in order to control foods. But this hazards-based food safety planning, HACCP, HARP-C, you might have heard it called, all right, it isn't the whole food safety system. It isn't your cleaning system. It isn't your approved supplier program, all right? It also doesn't even touch your production operations. Your HACCP plan is not your production plan, all right? It's not your OSHA compliance, all right? Though I will tell you, I have never been in a place that treats its workers badly that makes its food well. So let's keep that in mind. Okay, and then another big part of this, and we'll get into this when we talk about approved supplier planning in another set of slides, it doesn't talk about contracts, all right? There's no HACCP planning for your contracts. You just need to know what you make and how you make it and what you want your raw materials to be and how you want things distributed and write those service level agreements into your contracts. All right, so what is HACCP? You may have heard of HACCP before. All right, HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis for Critical Control Points. All right, and it is, if you're familiar with this, something called failure mode effect analysis. And I'll go through the origins of it in a little bit. But the idea is that it's a system. And it's a system that allows you to identify and evaluate the things that can go wrong with your food. All right, and it's part of the other systems that you create in your food company. So whether you have, whether you know or not that you have systems in a food company, you do. You have an HR system, you have an accounting system, QuickBooks or otherwise. You still have an accounting system if you have a checking account to run your business. You probably have ordering systems. You probably have distribution systems. Well, HACCP is a specific way of writing down a food safety system. Okay. So the FDA and a whole bunch of industry got together after the spinach scare back in the 2000s, and cantaloupe and peanut butter and a whole bunch of food safety issues. And they got together not only to form the Global Food Safety Initiative, but to change federal law. All right, and they created FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and FSMA covers everything that isn't the list that you see here and that I've talked about. USDA meat and poultry products, fisheries HACCP, because fish is covered under a certain set of HACCP regulations, juice HACCP, low acid canned food or acidified canned food. Though actually acidified canned foods are under preventive controls. All right, preventive controls is an awful lot like HACCP. It covers ingredients as well as processes though. All right, and then it creates this whole new level of documentation. And instead of calling something a critical control point, they call it a preventive control. It's a subtle difference. If you want to learn more, feel free to come take my preventive controls class. But there are some differences between preventive controls and HACCP. All right? But FSMA is actually a much broader rule than the preventive controls rule. Because the preventive controls rule is actually two rules. We have preventive controls for human food, and we have preventive controls for animal food. So before FSMA, there was no way anybody really knew whether or not they were conforming with the rules to take leftovers from the food manufacturing facility and bring it into the animal food stream, which is a very good way to minimize waste. Like, I'm a veterinarian. I like waste from the human food stream going into the animal food stream because I believe in using all the parts of an animal because those animals gave their lives up, and we should respect that. But the problem is that food manufacturing for animals has been poorly regulated in the past, and we're constantly having problems. You know, it's really sad. There were a couple of pugs killed earlier this year because there was so much euthanasia solution in their canned dog food, it killed them. That is a severe breakdown of the system that's supposed to be keeping our animal food safe. There was an incident in Washington State last year where 15,000 minks at a mink farm died from botulism from frozen chicken, because the frozen chicken had been frozen and thawed and frozen and thawed and frozen and thawed and was in plastic bags that essentially created an anaerobic environment in the middle of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about hazards. But that was, I mean, you know, animals, whether or not you agree with mink farming, they shouldn't die from botulism poisoning from dinner. Okay? So that's preventive. So preventive controls for animal food. There's a sanitary transport rule. I talked about that a little bit earlier. And the sanitary transport rule is the first time in American history where we have regulated the transport of food that has to be temperature controlled. So trucks have to be cleaned. They have to document that they're cleaned. They have to document that they're not putting the meat on top of the vegetables. That sort of thing. It's all real kind of common sense. And as you get into food safety and you look at these regulations, most of you will probably say, well, no kidding. Okay, but as I like to tell people, I have an entire business built off of the idea, don't eat the poop. All right, so there you go. There's your takeaway lesson, don't eat the poop. So then the next part of FSMA is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. Before FSMA was enacted into law, there was almost no way that we could assure that food coming in from overseas was safe based on FDA inspections. When FSMA was signed into law, the day FSMA was signed into law, there were 6, count them, 6 FDA inspectors located in China. The sheer volume of food that comes in through China, 6 inspectors couldn't inspect if they worked 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I mean, it's just like nonsensical. And so what the Foreign Supplier Verification Rule does is that it ensures that the companies that are importing food know that the food is safe. Because I don't have any other way to say it, but the FDA simply doesn't have the resources. Nor is it potentially the FDA's responsibility because companies, if they're importing food and selling it to Americans, should probably be taking the food safety of that food pretty seriously. Finally, FSMA covers something called the produce rule. And the produce rule is probably one of the more controversial parts of FSMA, but it brings food safety back onto the farm. So before this, that tomato grower that we saw, they didn't have any food safety rules regulatory to follow. There were no laws governing how food was grown. There was USDA GAP, Good Agricultural Practices, but that's certainly not mandatory. And as we found out with several leafy greens outbreaks, several salmonella outbreaks in sprouts and things like that, produce really needs to be covered under food safety because nobody was paying attention to it. So now we have produce safety under FSMA. So those are the general parts of FSMA: preventive controls for human food and preventive controls for animal food, sanitary transport, and foreign supplier verification. Okay, and all of those have their own set of food safety planning that can be kind of different from each other. So I didn't write the rules, and they're a little hard to explain. Okay, so then next, what does this all actually mean? The whole idea behind this, and we'll get into this in the next sets of slides as we go through this, is that food safety planning at the end of the day has to create the conditions to make safe food. All right, and one of the conditions is that people can stop the line when something goes wrong. If they know something is going wrong, they should be able to stop the line and keep it from going wrong and keep unsafe food away from consumers. Okay? HACCP is one way of doing that, and it's the best way that the government has found to make that happen. Not just HACCP, hazards-based food safety planning. Okay, and even companies that aren't subjected, and there are a few that aren't subjected to these rules, need to mitigate their risk in a way that they're not creating hazards for food out in the environment. Okay, so how did all of this come about? Well, these many years ago, when we were putting astronauts into space, somebody thought it would be a bright idea that the astronauts, if they were up there for any length of time, they needed to eat. Who knew? And so NASA contracted with Pillsbury to make food for astronauts to go into space. Pillsbury worked with the Natick Food Labs, which was a Department of Defense food lab in Natick, Massachusetts, down there on Route 9. And they were trying to figure out how they were going to, what were the physical characteristics that food had to be to go into space. But one of the things that they found is that they needed to do so much finished product testing to ensure that the food was safe that they didn't have enough food to go into space with the astronauts. And so clearly that doesn't work, right? So if you make 100 pounds of food and you have to destroy 90 pounds of it to feed the astronauts, but the astronauts need, 60 pounds of it to actually eat, you can't, that's like an impossible problem to solve. And so what ended up happening is that the food scientists went over to the rocket scientists and said, well, you don't do finished product testing, so how do you guys do it? Because what's finished product testing in rocketry? It's launch. You can't just cross your fingers and hope that the rocket makes it into space. We got astronauts sitting in there. And so what the NASA scientists had come up with is an engineering concept. It's called failure mode effect analysis. And basically what it is you take raw products, all right, and you make sure that the raw products are what they say that they are. And then you take those raw products and you assemble them. You do something to them and you change them. And you do a little bit of testing to make sure that that worked. And then you assemble them some more and you do a little more testing. But you do subsequently less testing as you get more and more assembled until at the end of the day you have an assembled rocket or an assembled jar of salsa. They're actually kind of the same thing from this perspective. Finished product testing is a disastrously inefficient way to test for food safety, okay? Because by the time you have that jar of salsa, all the time, money, effort, transportation, inventory cost, worker cost has already gone into that jar. And if something has gone wrong and that jar turns up to have botulism in it, well, where did it come from? We don't know. So we don't tend to look at finished product testing, all right? So that's where the hazard-based system came through. And then what happened was in the 70s, we had some really big foodborne illness outbreaks. And there was, again, in Massachusetts, a company making vichyssoise soup, which for those in the audience who don't know, is a tomato leek soup. Tomatoes are grown in the, or not tomato, potato leek soup. Potatoes are grown in the ground. Leeks are grown in the ground. The ground is naturally contaminated with botulism. And this company was making this potato leek soup and canning it, and they didn't know what temperature they were cooking the potatoes and the leeks to, and they didn't know what pressure they were canning it to, nor for how long. And cans were swelling, bursting, and several people died from botulism because this company didn't have any written records about how they were cooking their soup. It took 4 years for the FDA to shut them down. All right. As a result of that effort, we came out with the low acid canned food regulation. Then we came out with the acidified canned food regulation, which is basically, so low acid canned food is almost everything that you see on a shelf that, you know, where the top pops when you come out. Botulism is controlled at low pHs, and so if the product itself does not have a low pH, it's subjected to the low acid canned food because a low pH is a high acid food. A low pH is a high acid food, and so if it's a low acid food, it's above that threshold for controlling for botulism and needs to have a process control associated with it. Same thing with an acidified food. If you take something and you add acid to it, you're acidifying it to drive it below the threshold, but that still has to be a controlled process. And the FDA wrote the rules on all of that back in the 70s. Then that actually turned out to be working. So that was really good. The National Academy of Sciences established that HACCP and hazard-based controls can control microbial hazards in food. And by doing that, they created something called the NACMCF, National Advisory Committee on Microbial Criteria for Food. And those are the people with lots and lots and lots of letters after their last name that get together and decide what microbes are dangerous and why and what to do about them in our food. So that's NACMCF. And then after we had that, we got that all squared away, we created the Codex Commission, which is in FSIS, the Food Safety Inspection Service, so the people at the USDA who actually do the meat inspection. That may be changing, may be going to the trade office. And then, and everything was, you know, going along kind of fine, if you will. And then Jack in the Box came along in the early 90s. And I don't know how many of you remember the Jack in the Box, but several children died in the Northwest of the United States because Jack in the Box was receiving hamburger that was contaminated with Shigatoxin E. coli and then not cooking it appropriately. And all of this hamburger came out of the USDA inspected facility and probably multiple facilities. And it was a disaster of unimaginable proportions for the USDA. There are people I know who work for FSIS who have said they've never gotten, USDA institutionally has never gotten over Jack in the Box. And so what ended up happening is that the USDA adopted HACCP for all meat and poultry product inspection. It was adopted in 1996, and the very biggest meat plants had to start conforming in 1996. And then it was rolled out slowly to smaller and smaller meat plants until everybody was in conformance by 2001, I think it was. And everybody in meat and poultry products inspection has been producing under HACCP since then. Well, then that was the rewriting of the Meat and Poultry Product Inspection Act. And then, of course, FSMA came along in 2011 and rewrote the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. All right, and so that's kind of the history. That's what where everything comes from and how food is regulated. And so in our next set of lectures, we're actually going to talk about, so what does a food safety plan, a hazards-based food safety plan actually look like? So thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for that, and we look forward to seeing you at the next set of lectures.